Good evening, everyone. Uh, Welcome. Uh, so the topic of the day today is, as the Grandmaster Julie Scott just mentioned, is looking at intelligence in plants. This is a subject a number of years ago that we looked at, I guess about 7 years ago or so, and what we aim to do is recap some of that, but also to look at more recent research that spans the last 7 or 8 years. I should say everything that I'm going to present here is it's all limited by basically scientific inquiry and the limitations of scientific inquiry at this point, right? Some of it is suggestive of what other things that surely science will get to, but is a little bit slow to getting to. But so there's empirical data, research studies behind everything that is going to be presented here. Again, this just really shows more the limits of Western science at this stage, but it's quite fascinating what Western science has discovered through that research, though it has its limitations. I'm going to share my screen here, and let me. And here we go. So, there's this overarching question: are plants conscious? And it is a subject of debate, as basically here we like to say the roots of the plant debate. A little pun there, but useful, because this really goes back to the time of Aristotle, who created a hierarchy of kind of life or phenomena on the planet, and basically looked at plants as an intermediary sort of step in this hierarchy between inanimate, what viewed as inanimate, the mineral kingdom, and the clearly alive animal kingdom. So plants were kind of considered not as alive or as with the same functions and features as animals, but a bit more than rocks. And that kind of really kind of held sway. Charles Darwin, in his Origin of the Species, kind of echoed this type of approach to it, looking at plants, basically look at them as largely as kind of unthinking automatons, as they would call it, right? These are just things that spontaneously react to things, but there's no thinking or cogitation or mental activity involved. And that really, as you come forward, as the people look at genetics, right, and said, well, it's all genetically encoded. Even obviously, some scientists will try to explain pretty much all living things as being simply the result of DNA and biochemical encoding. But plants have kind of been stuck with that label much longer than humans or even animals, which now is a bit more debated. So, and really, a lot of this comes out of basically that plants are incapable of intelligent action due to their lack of a brain. So plants don't have a brain, they don't have a brain, so they can't do anything intelligent. You could say it's a bit of a myopic view. It makes a great assumption that one needs to have a brain, as we know it, to do anything intelligent, but that's kind of the way it is. And in 2009, and this I'll give you a sense of how intense this debate is in the field. 2009, the Journal of Plant Neurobiology, which was a pretty new journal at that time, 3 years after its founding, was basically forced by acclamation, by vociferous opposition in the scientific community, to change the name of the journal to Plant Signaling and Behavior. And the argument is they can't, do not have neurons, they don't have a brain, so it can't be neurobiology. You must take that name off of that. And so ultimately they renamed the publication to Plant Signaling and Behavior. And you'll notice it doesn't say anything about plant intelligence. There's signaling and behavior. So there's some sort of signal, chemical signal, et cetera, and some reaction to it. That really was made just in terms of the outrage that existed. And this is not terribly long ago. It's 2009, so 15 years ago at this point. And that journal, now simply called Plant Signaling Behavior, is still viewed a bit on the outskirts of kind of this typical scientific view. What's very interesting, if you contrast this with indigenous societies around the world regarding plants, right? So we know many shamans, the folks who kind of sort of play that bridge of kind of ingrained priesthood of sorts, or priestesshood, but figures between the kind of invisible world and the kind of very physical world. Many of those societies, the shamans there assert that plants communicate with them. This is a fundamental aspect of a lot of shamanic practices and the cosmologies really across cultures across the world. So very different view of plants. Plants obviously being plant spirits. They have spirits as a typical belief. They can convey messages, offer guidance, or provide healing knowledge. And I think what's quite interesting here is you'll find many people who have, I'm going to call it close relationships with plants. And I'm going to put quotes around relationships from a kind of orthodox scientific point of view, relationships with a plant, but yes, but people who have that kind of close communion with plants very often will say these same things about plants, right? That they get guidance, they convey messages, they provide healing knowledge, etc. And among the Amazonian tribes, they report that plants like the ayahuasca communicate with them, imparting wisdom and instructions on how to use other plants for medicinal purposes. So the plant world, basically, the plant intelligence talking to these shaman about other features of the plant world. They often have oral traditions that describe how their ancestors learned about the medicinal practices and uses of plants through direct communication with plant spirits. So very often they would say it was handed down through those sources. And here's one about the Seri people of Mexico. This is just one of many of these things, but it seemed interesting to highlight. They believe that their knowledge of plants was given to them by the plants themselves through dreams and visions experienced by their shamans, right? So clearly a very different view that we have in Western science about the kind of capabilities of plants. Many shamanic rituals and ceremonies frequently involve invoking the spirit of plants, seeking their assistance and blessings. So I think we likely have all seen some of that on either National Geographic, something, read it, or looked into it, or perhaps directly kind of became familiar with it through our own travels. So what are plant characteristics? These are kind of key things to think about the problem that we have with plants, the problem that scientists have with plants, and much of humanity as a result in terms of education, at least about plants, is that plants act on a much slower time scale than animals. I mean, drastically slower, right? So in that way, plants have been viewed as very inert and passive, right? So much slower time scale. Plants are also what they call sessile. They have a fixed location. Plants cannot get up and move, right? Wherever that seed germinates is where that plant's going to be. So plants have a fixed location. They move, though, through growth. So that's how plants move. They got to get to something, they do it through growth, right? They can't get up and pick up their roots and move over, but they can grow towards that. And that's how plants move. They have functions that are very similar to human senses, plus additional ones. And we're going to kind of go through that as we come through this. They employ very sophisticated methods of self-defense. And related to this, they communicate with others in the plant and animal kingdom. So I want you to think about this, right? So these plants, these living creatures, they can't move, right? Except through growth, where they can't get up, right? Therefore, they are then subject to all the possible threats that come their way, right? Could be other animals eating them. It could be plants, other insect species eating them. It could be other kind of pestilences, etc. So they don't have a way when a human being or an animal, right, is kind of put in harm's way, the human flees or the animal flees. Plants can't go anywhere. So I want you to think about that and think about the nature of life, that life goes to persist. Right? Life goes to, it's from the single cell all the way through, human beings and other animals and creatures. It goes to persist. So what's interesting, plants can't get them to move, but therefore they have adopted strategies to persist despite not being able to move. And that's what's so fascinating, I say, when you begin now to really pay attention. And you have these living forms that have been around actually for, 1 billion plus years, much longer than animals, right? They're the original kind of life form. And in fact, when they look at what they call the biomass, meaning the kind of mass of all kind of living things, plants comprise 80% of the biomass of the planet. 80%. So they are the dominant species, or the dominant kind of kingdom by far. And they've, of course, not been able to move. So you want to think about it. Life looks to persist. Life thinks and figures out a way. Right, because that's the consciousness, despite what science perhaps assert, that's the intelligence that's in plants. They figure out a way despite those seeming limitations. And that's what's fascinating about how plants actually do this. So what is intelligence? And that's, a topic in the scientific community. But basically, ability to sense environment, right? You can sense what's around you, process and integrate that information, decide on how to act in light of that information, and look how to solve problems with that, right? So those are your kind of key features that when you look at plants and any kind of intelligence, to say ability to sense their environment, process and integrate sensory information, decide on how to act, and use it to solve problems. And what's quite interesting, again, in this whole thing where you have to really kind of understand where the Western scientific community is and where it's not, is that even the most prominent scientists in this field, the botanists and others who study kind of a plant life, most of them will not commit to saying plants are intelligent, despite what you will see voluminous evidence of them basically meeting these basic criteria: sensing the environment, processing, integrating the information you get through sensing the environment, deciding how to act to solve problems. So quite fascinating. So we're going to look at how plants demonstrate intelligence. So let's look at how that goes about, right? So basically, plants are doing the same thing that all other animals are doing, and humans, right? Looking for self-preservation, seeking nutrients for food, reproducing, and avoiding irritation. And avoiding irritation basically means everything from obviously getting killed or eaten to death or just being put in pain, right? So living things, we all look to do this. How do I avoid irritation? I want to be in discomfort, right? People, humans, animal creatures all look to reproduce. We seek out food and we look for self-preservation, and that's built into the core. And a key thing that all living things have, because without self-preservation, the consciousness within them can't be expressed, and it can't evolve without, right, basically that entity, that physical entity, which serves as the channel for its expression. So all these plants basically pursue these same things. So if you look at the capabilities of plants, and by the way, I'm going to run through a lot of this because we've got a whole bunch of videos in here, which will take up a bit of time, feed them usefully. So I may be moving a little fast, but that's why. So what are some of the plant capabilities? Plants have memory, right? People can decide they want to label it this or that. Fortunately, there's enough scientists who kind of agree and recognize, there's nothing else to call it but memory, right? They can exhibit purposeful decision making. They can choose and decide this is more useful than that and actually pursue that course of actions, which you'll see. They can distinguish between themselves and non-self, right? So they got stems, they got roots. They can tell between their stems, their roots, and what is not them. As a matter of fact, they can even distinguish between, you'll see later on, between kin and non-kin, right? And lastly, plants can communicate with other plants and animals. So quite a number of these capabilities that are put to use now on how to basically take care of themselves, right? And lastly, they promote their own reproduction because that's how the species survive, just like human beings again, right? And there are various strategies they use to do these things. So let's look at plant bodies. And this again takes us back to why plants might be different. And someone put it like this, and I can't recall one of the researchers who studied this field for many years, said if humans were to encounter an alien species very unlike ourselves, right? It could very well be like plants, because they don't look like this. They don't have legs. They don't have a sense that we have eyes. They don't have ears. All the little animals we have, and even insects, right? You can find they got legs, they got antenna, they got all sorts of things that we say, oh, they have bodies like our own. And so some would say plants are the closest thing that we will encounter on this earth to alien life, even though they actually are the dominant life form. So what do we have? Plants don't have organs. They have no kidneys, liver, etc., right? No organs. And you think, well, why might that be important? They don't have organs, right? Let's think about it. Plants don't have a brain. We have a brain, so we can think about that. Though plants likely could think about it too, but plants don't have a brain, right? So there's no brain, which is why some of the scientists say, well, they can't, be intelligent and have a brain. Plants are modular. Now, you think about it, why do they have to be modular? Hey, plants have to tolerate being eaten. So if your brain was in one part of the plant and it's over here, and something comes along and eats it, you're done. Right? Human beings, something comes and busts up the brain, we're done. Plants are by nature being eaten constantly by animals or insects, right? So they must tolerate being eaten. So if you had organs, if you had a liver, oh, it ate my liver, you're done, right? You had a brain, it ate my brain, etc. So plants are modular in the sense that these things are not kind of they're not organized separately, but everything's kind of in together. The plant root tips and stem tips are key sensing and processing elements of plants. So these things, actually, the root tips and the little forward thing on their stem, the growing piece, lots of experiments have shown that this is kind of ways, and even going back to Darwin, actually, that plants, particularly with the roots, that plants sense their environment. There are sensing organs for them, in addition to doing a whole bunch of other things and bringing in nutrients, etc. So let's look at the plant senses, right? So plants have the 5 recognized human senses: sight, touch, smell, taste, and hearing. And we'll demonstrate that these slides, you'll see it. But they have additional senses, and undoubtedly a number of ones that are not yet recognized, but are kind of inferred. You can infer by some of the behaviors we see, but those don't have as much corroboration yet. So some of the additional senses: plants can sense humidity, they can sense water, they can sense oxygen, and they can analyze nutrients. Right now, we can't, we eat a food, we can't say, oh, that's got this and that in it, right? Yes, you might say, well, that's sweet, but being able to really analyze, oh, that's got this, that, that list of ingredients in the back of the package, we're not able to analyze by simply putting it in our mouths, right? That's why we're reading the back of those packages and frightening ourselves sometimes. So let's begin with it. Plants can see. Right, so some may recall this when this original presentation of years ago. Let's look at plants seeing. So plants, which is interesting now, they have now discovered that plants have at least 14 different types of light receptors. 14 different types of light receptors. We have rods and cones, right, in our eyes. Plants have at least 14 different types of light receptors, which allows them to have interesting capabilities. How do they know that plants can see? They use the very basic thing where no one disputes, in a sense, this plants can see, but using the criteria or the criterion that it can sense light, right? So that's how we say we can see. We can sense light. If you can't sense light, you say you can't see, right? So plants can sense light. How do we know? Because they grow toward the light, right? As well as their roots will grow away from the light, right? So clearly they are able to be sensitive to light, right? What's interesting about plants, though, is, it's like they say that, I don't know if this is exactly true, but, that folks from the kind of indigenous communities up in Alaska and Canada, the Inuit communities, etc., have, a dozen words for snow, different types of snow, right? Whereas, like, we don't really, right, down here. But plants can differentiate between different parts of the light spectrum very minutely to avoid shade, to identify kin, and to time the behaviors of doing certain things. So they don't have clocks and have watches. Right? What they are using is the sun and the sun's kind of the different spectrum that are dominant through this with the sun's light, which can tell them a variety of things, whether they're in a shade, whether the light is passing through a few plants or many plants, or what time of day it is. You get more, as we see with sunset, right? You get more reddish part of the spectrum shows up, and we can say, oh, it's sunset, right? So plants are able to basically kind of distinguish that. Plants can also see viable objects in their environment. You'll see that in one of these videos, right? They can kind of see, oh, there's over there, that's a viable object for me to go and pursue. It's kind of crazy. I mean, considering that we think we're kind of plant dumb. Actually, it's called plant blindness to some degree, but it's actually even dumb and blind, I think, for most of us as humans, right? So here's an example of plants doing a little bit of kind of seeing here, right? We're going to watch this one very short.
Yes.
This tree can see. To approach the support.
So a fine example of plants being able to discern that's in the environment, right? Somehow perceive it and then grow towards it. And the key thing, again, is this thing of the slowness, relative slowness of plant movement compared to human movement, right? Therefore, we don't think they're moving, but they're moving, they just meant moving plant time. There was, I think it was a Star Trek program, someone pointed out the other day, that had, it was a race of aliens who, looked at humans and thought that humans didn't move because humans move so slowly compared to them. So they thought they were inert, right? So I think looked at them as a meal. But anyway, here's another one on sight for plants, and this is a quite interesting one. I'll call it even astounding of sorts, but
there is a vining plant called Boquila trifoliolata that is challenging everything we know about how plants work and even raises a pretty bizarre question. Can plants see? This unassuming climbing vine is found in the temperate rainforests of Chile and Argentina, where it seamlessly blends in with its surrounding plants. In fact, it blends in with its floral neighbors so well because it literally changes its leaves to copy them. Boquila can alter almost every aspect of its leaves, including the size, shape, color, orientation, and stalk length, all in order to disguise itself like the trees it grows on for support. This may be an adaptation to avoid predation by both climbing on another leafy plant and blending in with its host leaves, which might be less tasty to bugs, slugs, and snails than Boquila leaves are. Boquila vines have also been found to mimic the leaves of more than a dozen species of trees, and they don't just stop at mimicking the plants they're climbing on, they can copy other nearby plants too, without even touching them. Not only that, but they can even grow multiple leaf shapes on a single vine, meaning they can mimic more than just one plant at a time. And the kicker is that scientists still don't know how these plants are able to do any of it. They do have a couple ideas, though. One fascinating hypothesis is that the vines are receiving the genetic blueprint to make these new shapes directly from those neighboring leaves. This neat trick is known as horizontal gene transfer, or the process of passing genetic material directly from one mature organism to another, as opposed to a parent giving their offspring their genes. Horizontal gene transfer is pretty common between single-celled organisms like bacteria, which pass around genes for things like antibiotic resistance, stuff that keeps the whole population healthy. And we also know that genes can be transferred between members of different species, even in multicellular organisms. For example, scientists have previously discovered that genes have jumped between rice and another type of grain called millet, despite the fact that those two species diverged between 30 and 60 million years ago. But exactly how horizontal gene transfer works in plants is still a bit of a head-scratcher and has been considered an unlikely mechanism for something as complex and sophisticated as rapid mimicry. For a little bit of context, gene transfer changing a plant's appearance would be like a handshake changing your eye color, or someone sneezing on you making your hair curly. It feels a little out there. But in 2021, some of the same researchers that originally described the shape-shifting properties of Boquila vines came up with a plausible mechanism for these plants swapping genes. Their idea is that airborne bacteria carry genetic material from the neighboring plants to Boquila's leaves, and the leaves can then integrate that information into their own genes and use it to change shape. This is wild, but it outlines how strange of a problem it is. So to test this, they sequenced the DNA and bacteria from Boquila leaves as well as the leaves from plants it had copied. When they compared the bacterial communities, they found an overlap between Boquila and the mimicked plants. Not only that, but there were significant differences between the bacteria on the Boquila leaves that had changed shape and the Boquila that hadn't. These results hint that bacteria may be playing a role in the exchange of genetic material, which would be a pretty revolutionary idea, botanically speaking. That said, the authors also acknowledge that more has to be done to lock down this hypothesis. It's a pretty extraordinary claim. It would need pretty extraordinary evidence. But there is another, even wilder possibility for how Boquila has become a master of disguise. A recent study has explored the rather controversial idea that these vines can see. The science fiction-y idea that plants might be able to see has actually been around since 1905. That's when Austrian botanist Gottlieb Haberlandt suggested that the outer layer of cells on a leaf could act as a lens focusing the rays of light onto light-sensing cells, which altogether is called an ocellus. We have found some forms of photoreceptors in plants, but whether they allow plants to actually see shapes or colors or even exist at all has yet to be confirmed. But that hasn't stopped researchers from exploring the idea of plant vision in Boquila. In a 2022 study, researchers decided to give some Boquila plants an eye exam. Since they knew that Boquila can mimic living plants, they decided to see if the vines could copy fake plastic plants too. Since a plastic plant doesn't have any genes to transfer, it would mean that if Boquila was able to mimic these leaves, it was not doing so by using genetics or any chemical signals from the host. They also grew other vines below a shelf, blocking their line of sight to the fake plants. As the Boquila vine grew toward the artificial plant, its leaves started to morph, reportedly becoming more like the fake leaves, while the Boquila branches hidden by the shelf got bigger but didn't change shape, all of which the authors argue supports their idea that Boquila can see. Now, to be clear, other plant biologists are pretty skeptical of the plant vision hypothesis, going as far to call the idea, quote, far-fetched. Not only that, but several researchers have criticized the design of that 2022 study, saying the variables that can influence leaf shape, like the age of the leaves and light exposure, weren't properly controlled for. They also criticized the lack of explanation for how plant vision could reasonably work, since the whole hypothesis hinges on the plants actually being able to see stuff. But the study's authors stand by their work and are currently doing more experiments with Boquila plants to further investigate their plant vision hypothesis. And even the critics will concede that they won't say it's impossible that plants can see. We might even find that both horizontal gene transfer and plant vision are at play when these guys mimic their neighbors. These weird copycats are just one more example of how little we really understand about the natural world. Because who knows, maybe when you look at that houseplant on your desk, it's looking back at you. There is a vining...
So that's, yes, it might be looking back at you. So plants also can smell. So the first illustration we had where the thing was seeking out the pole, is another one of those ones that would suggest that plants can somehow perceive. We know they can see light, or they sense light because of the growing patterns toward the light, etc. We saw the thing with the little pole, and now you've got this very unusual mimicry. So it's an interesting area still argued about, but quite interesting. Plants can also smell. And so smell is basically our reaction to chemicals in the air, right? That's kind of what smell is. There are chemicals in the air that are released by whatever it is, and we can react to that. And as we know, humans have a fairly crude faculty of smell versus like a dog, which is, in theory, can sense things at about 10,000 times the capability of humans, as an example. So, but plants can smell, and what's interesting about them, they produce over 1,700 organic chemical compounds themselves, which they exude. A volatile simply doesn't mean an explosion. It's just a term meaning that these chemicals they produce evaporate into the air, and that's how they're transferred, right? And because they evaporate into the air, and the air goes around and goes to the other plant or goes wherever it lands, right? So plants produce over 1,700 different volatile organic compounds. I mean, they say plants are an amazing chemical factory, which is where obviously your pharmacy started, right? Pharmaceuticals started out of plants, right? People finding in the forest or other places natural things, and these compounds help address diseases and ailments that people had. So also, plants and insects respond to chemical signals emitted by other plants. So they can produce chemicals, but they also respond to chemical signals produced by other plants. Insects also respond to those volatiles, as they call them. These just odors, we might say, or things emitted. Now, what's interesting also is plants produce specific volatile chemicals depending on a threat. It's a selective thing. Oh, this is what that is. So they will send out they will produce, radiate, exude a different chemical compound based on when they're being eaten by one thing versus something else that's perhaps walking on them. Keep in mind, by the way, and this was the most disturbing thing years ago when I first began reading about this stuff, is the smell of fresh grass, which we love, is really a signal to other plants that, wow, something's cutting us up here, right? And it's going to, come cut you up as well if you're not careful. But generally, if you're on a lawn, it's too late. So that smell from we go, ah, that smells so good. No, that's plants going, and now some of the theory also around this or speculations that because some of the nature of the volatile chemical that the plants kind of radiate upon being cut has a substance that's very close to an anesthetic and uses an anesthetic in for animals and humans. So some have speculated that, well, they're producing it because it's an anesthetic as well. So that whole thing of whether plants can feel pain is a whole another topic. But anyway, every time you smell that fresh cut grass, it's the plants thing. There was a slaughter that just took place. But plants, they get eaten and they survive. So it's part of like being a plant. Odor observed when in the forest, by the way, again, is that odor we say, that forest smell is created by the volatile chemicals produced by plants, right? So they're exuding all these chemicals. Again, it's called volatile mainly because they just evaporate into the air. So plants can smell. Plants respond to touch, and this has obviously been demonstrated in many different ways, and we're just going to look at a couple of here. Plants respond to physical contact with other objects. Repeating touching of a plant can stunt its growth. So then there may be a variety of conditions around that mitigate this effect, right? But when they've done studies, because keeping in mind, if you're a plant, something touching you seems like, uh-oh, threat, right? Is it an insect? Is it a deer? You don't want to be touched. They're worse than New Yorkers, like on a subway, like, don't touch me, right? So plants, now granted, there are people perhaps who have habituated their plant to being touched, but generally plants will, when they're touched kind of more randomly, will kind of produce a certain stress response that they can measure, right? And actually what they've shown in some studies that plants that are touched, perhaps again without the loving care of their companion human, will actually not grow as well as plants that aren't kind of irritated that way. So we're going to look at three different, actually look at four videos, but looking at plants responding to touch. So there's the Mimosa pudica, which is a fairly famous one. Venus flytrap, even more famous. Then we look at some kind of clinging vines as well. And we'll let the videos kind of take this away. They're pretty much self-explanatory. So that effect, the Mimosa pudica, is basically two things that happen when it does that. It's closing its leaves to movement to perhaps scare off insects, right? Plants moves, oh, what's with that? Secondly, it allows them to put up some spikes on the underside of their leaves to make it to their target. Of course, in a plant doing that, as you'll see talked about a little later on, in closing its leaves, it's cutting off a good deal of its light gathering capability, which is how it eats. As this wonderful book is titled, The Light Eaters. Plants eat light. That's their food, right? They created, through photosynthesis, sugars and other things out of it, but that's what they kind of feed on is light. Here we can look at a vine, no, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm going to go back. Skip the Venus flytrap here for a moment. Okay, so let's look at the Venus flytrap. We're all familiar with this plant. There's a couple of things to know about it that you can see if you look carefully. There are four look very fine little needles sticking up inside on the pods, right? Two on each side, and maybe it's three on each side. They're sticking up there, and those really are sensing triggers in the plant. So you'll see what happens here with this little insect. Plants looking, the insects looking for lunch, and it becomes lunch. So what happens in there, if the insect, and we'll refer to it later, if the insect touches a couple of those little kind of triggers, hair-like triggers that are up, basically within 20 seconds, the trap will close. So it knows the plant knows there's something moving around, living inside of it, and then it has another little period where it really kind of makes sure how it's going to handle it. But let's look at this vine. This is vine's kind of doing some similar behavior here, retouching. So this vine there is looking, it's a vine-like plant, is looking for something to attach itself to. It's looking around, looking around, looking around, looking around, kind of growing to extend itself, right? And as soon as it finds something, right, it begins to wrap itself around it. It knows what it's doing in that sense. Creeping vines. This one, by the way, is Oprah Winfrey kind of narrating this for us. Already a little bit of Oprah. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean what's going on? Why is my okay? Sorry.
60 feet above them. Luckily, other plants, trees, have already made the trip, and the
Like 60
vines
feet up.
can hitch a ride. They won't get very high unless they can hold on tight. Like fingertips searching for a hold, this ivy's adhesive pads grip the bark. Some creepers use sharp claws to grapple onto the steep tree face. A cat's claw creeper hooks its tendrils into the tiniest crevices and hauls itself to the top.
The plants are coming for you. Be careful. Okay. So that's the touch. But also now we're going to see all taste comes into it as well, right? So plants respond to these volatile chemicals or these, odors or whatever emitted by other plants. What's interesting, so some plants can distinguish between the saliva of various insects to summon the right defender. That's where then they selectively basically produce the right chemical to get the right defender. An example, right? So looking again at taste, so that Venus flytrap, when it closes, right? It's first of all, something needs to strike within 20 seconds, those at least two of these little triggers. But then again, it could still be something that blew in or something that's not what it's looking for. So it will basically, it's looking for additional movement over the next X number of seconds, about 5 seconds or so, to really know that it's caught something or it's trapped something. And if that turns out not to be something that's edible, that trap will reopen in 12 hours. If it is edible, it'll spend the next 5 to 12 days digesting it. So the plant can tell what's in there. It analyzes clearly what it's got when it's kind of captured, and will analyze it and decide based on that information whether to reopen more immediately or to digest it. So plants can hear. This is kind of a fairly well-known thing. Plants can interpret and act on sound. They respond to a recording of the sounds of a caterpillar eating a leaf. And that's very well known with the corn plants, and you'll see that a little later, corn and tobacco plants, that just playing the recording for a plant of a caterpillar, a certain type of caterpillar eating a corn plant, will get the plant to respond by basically emitting certain chemicals. Just hearing the sound of it eating a leaf, so they can hear this. Plants will also wrap themselves around pipes, and they say this is the problem for plumbers and others who work outdoors, of plants wrapping their roots around water pipes because they're hearing the sound of water and they're trying to find water. Now, many people talk about plants and music. Well, what most of the research seems to now point out is that plants will grow faster in the presence of certain types of sound waves, including music and audio tunes. So it's not because it's Mozart or it's because it's this or that. It's the pressure waves that apparently vibrate the leaves of the plant that promote the growth. And plants also look to communicate. It's very kind of on the cutting edge of being deciphered to communicate through a type of mechanical clicking sound they do at the root level. So when I was mentioning that under stress, that plants will kind of signal they will accelerate this clicking sound when they're under stress. Plants can sense gravity, and they can tell always in order to make their shoots grow upward and their roots go downward. And here's a little video illustrating it.
You reap what you sow, but seeds somehow tend to know that they have to send roots downwards and stems upwards. It does not matter in what position you sow seeds. They always grow the right way. How does a seed know which direction is right? From where does a small seed get all this intelligence? This question intrigued scientists for a long time. Suppose you have a seedling in a pot and you turn it upside down. Then the stem will take a U-turn and start growing in upward direction against the gravity. So the stems always grow in a direction opposite to gravity, and roots always grow in the direction of gravity. In short, plants can sense gravity.
So pretty straightforward. So plants also communicate like social entities. So they communicate with other plants and other animals. So, but as people have described it, chemicals are the language of plants. So as we mentioned before, there's at least 1,700 chemicals that various volatile chemicals that plants can produce, organic chemicals, meaning kind of, naturally occurring from their bodies. And so these chemicals are the language of plants. That's how they transmit kind of to others. Whereas we know birds use sounds and bird calls, etc. We use a variety of means as humans. They do this atmospherically, right? So they emit these chemicals, and then the plant down the way, you just to the side of them or further down, whatever, can pick those things up. So they do it using the atmosphere, but they also do it level. So there's a fungal network that plants basically connects plants, and some of those networks extend literally miles, actually. Right. So at the root level, there's two types of dominant funguses that are kind of present for this, it seems. But they will then share information and other things through this root network. And here's some examples of plants also interact with animals. So this is kind of quite interesting, and I'll try to do this fast because we've got to move through this somewhat. But mustard plants respond to the presence of bee pollinators that bite their leaves by blooming as much as 30 days ahead of schedule. So basically, a bunch of bees come up, which is what plants need. These mustard plants need to pollinate, to reproduce, right? They can't do it. That's how they do it. Bee gets pollen, helps them reproduce, and that's one of the basic fundamental drives in life, right? So if bees kind of show up prematurely before the flowers have bloomed, what the bees will do in some cases, they will bite the leaves. Now the bees don't get any nutrients out of leaves. So the scientists are very perplexed. Why would they bite the leaves? They don't get any nutrients from eating leaves, bees. Well, what it does is it actually stimulates the plant by the presence of the bees to go and bloom while the bees are there. Because at the end of the day, what the plant needs is bees to carry its pollen away. So they will bloom even up to 30 days ahead of schedule when the bees show up prematurely and begin biting the leaves. So that's plants interacting with animals, responding to the animals in that case. Monkey flowers, which are kind of interesting. So they'll emit a fragrance to fool bees into thinking that their flowers have abundant or excess of pollen available, even when they don't, in order to attract the bees as pollinators. So they will put out an odor, apparently, as some scientists describe it as, is to bees, when they smell this odor, they go, wow, that odor is like, wow, there's a lot of pollen there. So what monkey flowers do is, even if they don't have a whole lot of pollen, they'll go out and exude, produce this chemical, which produces odor, this fragrance, right? And that will attract the bees. The bees won't get what they came for exactly, but the flower will get what it came for, which is having the bees take away its pollen. Something called a purple devil plant, quite interesting. I can see why they call it the devil, particularly if you're a caterpillar. When attacked by caterpillars, it produces a sticky, sugary substance that the caterpillars eat, right? They like it, but then they say it's like taffy. It kind of glues their mouth shut, the caterpillars, so they can't eat, they starve, right? Plant. So again, you're stationary, right? You're a plant. You can't go anywhere, right? So you got to be creative. Like, how do you defend yourself? All living things, are going to look at how to is that preserve the expression of the species and their physical bodies, right? So quite an interesting defense. Something called a bittersweet nightshade secretes a sugary substance, and this is not unusual with these plants, so that the plant will basically recruit insects to do its bidding. So in this case, the sugary nectar in order to recruit ants that'll pluck off the larva of the flea beetle, which basically would otherwise bore into the plant and kind of suck its stuff out of it, right? It recruits, it puts us in nectar, the ants come to it, but then the ants eat off all the larvae. So now spider orchids, which you're going to see on this next one, quite interesting. Spider orchids distribute their pollen by convincing a certain species of wasp to try to have sex with them by imitating the shape and emitting the pheromones of female wasps. So it's again, we saw that thing about the shapes and how the Bacilla, that Peruvian plant kind of changes shape. Well, this plant basically has developed a way of attracting wasp to come, thinking that it's a female to mate with, and therefore interact with the plant, take away the pollen, and then go take that pollen to another plant. And here we're going to see a little video.
The orchid has a different strategy. It synchronizes its emergence with the brief mating season of the tinid wasp.
Oh, no. Okay, but keep watching while I go and take care of my battery. Excuse me.
The flightless female wasp produces pheromones to attract males. This male detects a scent that seems to be hers. Yet flies right on by. The orchid not only has the same shape and color as a female wasp, but it sits at the same height as she does. It even mimics her smell. And the beguiled male attempts to mate with it. It hammers against the orchid's pollen sacs. And the wasp leaves, doubtless a little shaken, only to be duped once again. The pollen on his back now sticks to this different orchid, and the deception has worked.
Chemicals emitted they emit chemicals to deter herbivores, and some examples of this. Acacia trees produce tannins when grazed by animals, making them unappealing and even enough to kill some herbivores. So this was an example that they saw in Southern Africa, where a bunch of these kind of gazelles were dying off, and they couldn't figure out why. When they did autopsies on them, they found they had these high degree concentration of tannins in them, and that was because the acacia trees cranked up the amount of these tannins they were producing because they were being overgrazed due to a shortage of other food being available to these antelopes, and that is ultimately. The other example is that corn plants emitting a chemical to attract wasps to eat the caterpillars, and that one I was alluding to earlier, where they can selectively do that. So plants also communicate for defense. I just want to share this with you.
Other experiments have looked at the chemicals trees produce to signal that they're being damaged by voracious insects, pathogens, or human activity. One experiment looked at tomato plants, all linked up through an arbuscular mycorrhizal network. When the researchers infested some of the plants with leaf-chewing caterpillars, healthy neighbors had activated 4 defense-related genes within 6 hours. In other words, they knew trouble was coming and they were preparing for it. As it turns out, this preparation helped them. The plants that had time to produce defensive enzymes against the pest fared better, and the caterpillars munching on those second plants didn't grow as large.
So we can see an example
Other
of
experiments
plants. Plants also share resources. They do this basically through this fungal network, which is at the root level. Large trees will share resources with smaller ones until smaller ones are able to reach the sunlight. This is well documented, all this I'm describing. Plants also favor kinship plants, right? So if a plant is a kind of an offspring of the plant, it will avoid shading them above the ground because plants normally go for light and will compete for that light, and they'll avoid root competition below ground. So because then the roots are searching out for nutrients, so they're competing for nutrients below the ground. But if it's a kinship plant, a related plant, it will kind of reduce that type of behavior. Plants that stay green year-round, so your evergreens, and when you look at a bunch of trees, are sharing nutrients with plants that lose their leaves during the winter, because leaves, we know, the way that plants take in energy, photosynthesis of the sunlight, and those plants aren't able to, therefore, without their leaves, to generate as much activity and produce sugars, etc. And so trees that are evergreens will share nutrients below ground. This here is another example of plants sharing.
The first inkling that trees might actually work together came in a study in the early 1980s. Scientists planted pines side by side in a box in the lab, then inoculated their roots with the mycorrhizal fungi to establish an underground fungal network. Then, they tagged the photosynthetic sugars produced by the donor pine with radioactive carbon. They did this by sealing one plant in a box with radioactive carbon dioxide. They then allowed the pine to absorb it and convert it into radioactive sugars through photosynthesis. Then, they placed photographic film over the side of the root box, hoping to see where the radioactive particles traveled from one plant to the other, or if they traveled at all. When they developed the film, they saw the path that the charged particles had taken, and the path was through the mycorrhizal fungal network, traveling from one tree to the other. The idea that trees may share resources presented scientists with an evolutionary paradox. Trees have always been known to evolve by competing, not cooperating. Trees grow tall to reach the most sunlight. Their roots branch far and wide to suck up the most water. Those that get shaded or reach less water often don't survive. If trees of the same species, or even of different species, shared resources, scientists would be forced back to the drawing board with their understanding of how trees have evolved. And this idea is what got researcher Suzanne Simard excited. In one of her early experiments, she looked at nutrient exchange between Douglas fir trees and paper birch trees, two different species that grow together in forests and sometimes compete for space and light. She planted fir, birch, and cedar seedlings in a trio. She labeled the paper birch with the radioactive isotope carbon-14 and labeled the Douglas fir with the stable isotope carbon-13. That way she could tell not only if carbon was moving from birch to fir, but could tell if it was moving from fir to birch. The cedar plants acted as a control. Cedar can't form mycorrhizal networks with the fir or birch for the simple reason that it forms arbuscular mycorrhiza, not ectomycorrhiza like the other two. If cedar roots acquire any of the labeled sugars created by fir or birch, it would mean that they had leaked through the soil, not through the fungal network. She then covered the fir with a shade tent, reducing the amount they were able to photosynthesize. If the two trees were linked in a mycorrhizal network, cooperating with one another, then the surplus of photosynthetic sugars from the birch should flow into the roots of the fir. And what she found was that the birch and fir trees indeed share resources. In fact, the more shade the fir was covered by, the more carbon-14 it received from the birch. And the cedar did not receive either of the isotopes. Further experiments showed that these two species are also able to share nitrogen and share resources in both directions depending on the season and conditions. The two species exist in an alternate feedback system, helping each other when the other needs it, allowing them both to remain healthy.
So, as I mentioned, plants can recognize their kin through various ways. They're able to see this, how plants grow out their roots in the presence of their kin or not, uh, what kind of secretions they put into the soil, how much they kind of grow their stems out, right? Because the stems are where actually growing, and that tends to lead to shade for other plants, which is not what plants want. They also, it's interesting that plants very often at the root level will release chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants' roots, right? But they don't do that with their kindred plants, right? And they will actually, this shade avoidance response where they will, avoid. Normally, we look to grow out to get the light when it's crowded, and just grow as fast as you can to make sure you get to the light. But they don't do that the same way when they're with. They don't try to outcompete their neighbors when they're kinship plants. So there's a great deal going on there. I want to take you to. We talked about plants remembering. We've seen with the Venus fly trap, and being able to remember for 20 seconds. We saw So one of the things about Mimosa pudica, but this is again looking at plants learning, and this is really important because it's not simply anyone could say it's just a genetic response. Because look at how this example of plants learning, and this is going to be described by this woman here, who's the woman who's speaking is actually a quite prominent, very prominent plant scientist, but she's.
I did the same experiment and I used mimosa. It was a plant that was used from Darwin to Bose and many others. And actually it's a plant that even from the ancient times, it's always attracted our attention. Why? Because it moves at our time scale. And so we can actually see it doing something. And basically the question was the same. It's like if I do something that is kind of scary or disturbing at first, but it's not deadly, it looks like it could be potentially a problem, but actually through experience, the plant should realize that nothing really happens. So this plant closes the leaves quite rapidly when it's disturbed. And so, as you just saw, I created this kind of torture thingy. But no plants were hurt, really, during the conduction of these experiments. So basically, I would drop the plant, and the base of that structure is foam. So the plant will be dropped from a set height. And of course, the first time that the plant is dropped, the plant closes the leaves because it's like, what was that? Then you do it again, and then you do it again. And that's exactly what we would do if it was an animal. You repeat, and you repeat several times. And in my what we call that repeat is a train. And the train for this experiment was like 60 drops consecutively. But what happened, as you can see from that cartoon, is that the plants actually, after 2, 3 of those supposed to be 60 drops, they were like, oh, I got it. I got it. Nothing is happening, and I'm not bothering closing my leaves. And it makes total sense because, of course, open leaves, full photosynthetic capacity, right? When you close your leaves, you might protect yourself from predators, for example, so that you look smaller, or this plant has got spines that stick out when the leaves are closed. So, it's you're defending. But if there is actually no danger, you're defending against nothing. But by closing, you are cutting away your opportunity to feed on light. And for this plant, when the leaves are closed, it loses like 40% of photosynthetic capacity. That's a lot, especially if there's no reason. And so in my experiment, actually, I had plants that were in an environment where there was lots of light. So making mistake is not that critical. You can make an extra mistake and it's okay. But there was a group of plants, sorry, that was actually in an environment where there was sufficient light, but not an abundance of light. So making the wrong decision there could have been more critical. And as you can guess, what the plants do is like when they are in good environments, they take their time to learn. They still learn, but they are slower. And, whatever. I can drop another time. While the one that are in low light environments, of course, there is an urgency to get it right, because that could be, in a real scenario, could be a really dangerous thing to do if you don't get it. And so those plants learn very quickly. And so it's, oh, excellent, plants, you know, looks like they're learning the trick. So then what you do is like, I wonder how long they can remember this. So I thought like 3 days. I'll come back in 3 days. That should be enough. They won't remember. And they did. Just as if we just did that. And then I said, okay, then I'll come back in 6 days. And again, it was like, yeah, we know this trick. And I thought, fine then. So I left them for a month. And not only that, but I divided my original groups, low light, high light, in half. Some of the plants stayed in those groups where they, you know, so the environment where they learned the trick remained the same as when then I tested them a month later. But the other half of each group got swapped. So some plants learned in a low light environment, but then they found themselves tested in a high light environment, and vice versa. And so, you know, suddenly it's like, okay, so you learned a trick, but it's context dependent. So would you change what you're doing? And what was interesting, many things were interesting. One, that after 28 days, the plants were like, yeah, it's the drop. Would you stop it? I mean, it's a bit annoying, actually, so if you don't mind. We got it. And so that was the first embarrassment. It's like, okay, great. And but the other really interesting thing was that, of course, the plants that stayed in the environment where they were trained, they just performed as expected. The plants that went from a low light environment, from a high light environment to a low light environment, so they learned in a comfy place, but then they found themselves in a not so comfy place. Well, those guys suddenly behaved as like, oof, the environment is gone bad. And so the response was very quick. But the interesting part was for the other group, the one that went from the low light environment to the high. And you're like, now you can relax. The environment is going good, right? But they don't. And what's my suspicion is that what they're doing is like, not only they are learning the trick and they remember it, but they're also learning another aspect of that context, which is the environment changes. The environment can change, and it went from bad to good once, so it can return to bad again. So they remain on alert, as if it's like, okay, anytime now, it could just go back that way, and, you know, so we're ready. And they do this, and of course, there is no brain or neurons, and that is the part that is very disturbing.
So I'm going to show you just a few more videos that I think will make a lot of points here. So I'm going to kind of go fast to a little bit of the narrative, because I think the videos will, in many cases, speak for themselves. But what you're going to see now, this video is a study published in this journal, Plant Signaling and Behavior, which used to be called the Journal of Neurobiology, right? And it was actually a story in the New York Times on it as well. They took this plant, and it's a flowering plant in the Andes, and this plant moves its stamen, right? S-T-A-M-E-N, stamen is pronounced. And it moves those from kind of being scattered among the petals to like in the center of the leaf, or the center of the plant, right? When it's time for pollinators to come, for bees, right? Because that's how they're going to get that pollen distributed, right? And so they actually move it from the outer to, again, clustering in the center. In laboratory experiments, they found that these plants will adjust the timing of the movement of their stamen based on their prior experience with pollinators. So if pollinators, and this is using a lab, so they could time that when they wanted to expose them to the pollinators, that if they kind of made it a 15-minute cycle, the plant would operate afterwards on a 15-minute cycle of presenting their stamen. If it was on a 45-minute cycle, which was the other cycle, right, then they would do it every 45 minutes, but they could anticipate the timing of the visits. And we know there's a lot of behavior in plants that, you know, use light to signal things. This one looked to be time, simply, which is a little bit what you see also when you look at the Venus flytraps, right? They're actually, you know, basically counting 20 seconds off, and then they actually have a second piece, which is another 5 seconds before they're acting. So they're using time, in that case, not simply the time of day, which, you know, easily determined by the light. So the plants, as they say, apparently remember the past and try to repeat. Now, this video you're going to see, and you can see many other plants have demonstrated this kind of response. This, I want you to watch. It's about a minute or 20 seconds, but the little white things with little yellow things on the end, these kind of in the middle, you're going to see this movement's in real time. of how these plants kind of gather the stamen, which are the ones that have little pollen balls on them. You're going to see how this happens. So to watch the one on the outside, the one that's on the outside at the moment. And this is in real time. And granted, this is very fast for a plant. Of course, like when you've been around for billions of years, time is different for you. So this plant is getting ready, anticipating that the pollinators, the bee, is going to be coming shortly, and preparing that stem. So when the bee comes in to go for the nectar, right? It's going to encounter all those stamen with the pollen on them. So all those gathered that same way. So again, here's another video with emphasizing this point about plants recognizing self versus non-self, which is also quite fascinating. Vines avoid wrapping around their own stalk. So you'd say, well, how do they know that's their own stalk when they're doing this? They also, when they're not going to go and mess with their own roots. So here's an example of a plant, and this is just a lay person who took this. Why did I give me whatever? Get back here.
Okay, another thing about this plant. Down here, it wrapped around another plant stem. And over here, it wrapped around another plant stem. And over here, another plant stem. However, it never wraps around its own stem. So how does it tell the difference between its stem and any other one?
So we're going to look at also plants making choices. And what the scenario is here, that's, they seek out nutrients in soil, and they will change the growth of their roots based on where they find the higher concentration or they anticipate the higher concentration of whatever the nutrient is. And they can direct their root growth around obstacles, right? They're encountering a rock, they will actually, before they hit the rock in the soil, they'll begin to go around it, which is still baffles scientists of how they're able to do this. So let's look at this one of as they say, a plant making a choice.
Another thing, I put this can here 3 days ago, and this tendril has no interest in trying to wrap around it. So, in contrast, I put this paintbrush handle here an hour ago, and there it is, wrapped around it. So how does it tell the difference in an appropriate size that it knows it can grip before it attempts to grip it? Is that vision? Is that some kind of electromagnetic field? What's going on with that?
A lot to be gained by watching plants. Here you will see it looks to be like three kind of plants. There's a little thing in the middle. So that's the it's a parasitic vine. And a parasitic one basically lives off of a different plant. It goes in, it doesn't do its own photosynthesis. Is that kind of, taking sunlight and, the chlorophyll and making, sugars out of it. But it will go and grab onto another one and basically colonize that other plant. And it has preferred ones. There are ones that are better and more attractive for the plant than others. And you'll see this plant now choosing between basically what is the more abundant one in terms of the resources that it can secure from it.
Between the wheat and tomato, because the tomato is easier to parasitize.
So it's again choosing constructively what is in its kind of best interest. So I want to look at and say, where are we now? And so we're going to kind of get there, coming to wrap this up with you. So right now, the dominant scientific view remains based on historical assumption that only humans are intelligent, and that other living forms are just automatons responding automatically and unthinkingly to simulation. So what's very interesting is some scientists have criticized this view as being very anthrocentric, meaning human-centric, as compared to, so the criticism usually is when you're assigning intelligence or describing the actions of animals or plants as intelligent, very often the charge we made is you're anthropomorphizing, right? Basically projecting onto this other thing human characteristics. What some other scientists are noting now is that humans somehow or another are so anthrocentric that we believe we're the only intelligent species, and therefore we can't accept that there's intelligence in other things, right? It's very much like at one point we thought, the Earth was the center of the universe, right? And then, it was, quite blasphemous to consider, no, it's not the center of the solar system even, right? So this notion of only humans are intelligent, and that's still kind of very much in the way. That's recognizing something else. So, when they classify the observed behavior of animals or plants or intelligence, therefore it's considered anthropomorphizing their behavior. And that's a terrible criticism that one scientist can level at another. Only in recent years have there been significant changes in this view in case of animals, right? As controlled experiments repeatedly demonstrate their animals' ability to solve problems, make tools, and have individual personalities. And all three of those things, in a sense, were things that were distinctly considered to be human. Being able to solve problems, make tools, and now you have crows and monkeys and other things making tools, right? And that they have very distinctive personalities, right? They're not all just computer programmed automatons. So the question of plants' conscious entities is the next thing beyond the intelligent. And I would just here's where things are, fortunately or unfortunately, in the scientific community. So while more scientists are acknowledging certain plants' behaviors as intelligent, but I will say, if you read up on this and watch conversations, most scientists are hesitant of referring to the behavior as intelligent. They'll avoid that label. The view that plants are conscious is still highly controversial and generally vehemently opposed by the dominant voices in the scientific community. I mean, vehemently opposed. It's extreme. So some scientists would note that computers employing massive computing power applied to enormous data sets can make productive decisions, but are not conscious. And obviously, we call it artificial intelligence now, with Chat GPT as an example, right? So say, well, those things are making decisions, but they're not conscious. Scientists who openly state their positions that plants are conscious face harsh and dismissive criticism from their peers in the scientific community. I mean, harsh and dismissive. And that woman scientist there, Monica Galliano, actually, who's got an enormous research track record, nowadays very often is referred to by some of the other peers in the field who are studying kind of these issues, but to feel that she's much too far gone, and therefore, unfortunately, they're going to be 3 times as critical of our research because of some of the positions she now takes. The difficulty also, and why you find this reluctance, and this reluctance is not only about plants, but it's also something that we see anything around parapsychological phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, any of these type of experience, that scientists realize that if they are identified with giving credibility to those things, they will have difficulty getting research grants in their field and have their research published. Because the how you get a grant, a research grant in these fields from the NIH and National Science Foundation, et cetera, or a group of scientists review your proposal. If those scientists say, well, no, you're saying plants are conscious, that's total BS and outlandish, therefore you're not going to get grants. And if you can't get grants, or even if you do find a way to do research, that the most prominent journals are not going to publish your research because they'll be criticized for publishing quackery. So it's quite a challenge. So this notion of plant consciousness is still very far. So you want to look and say, well, let's look at Rosicrucianism and plant consciousness. I want you just to kind of bring us back to kind of where we all start. The Rosicrucian viewpoint is that there is only one universal consciousness, typically referred to by Rosicrucians as cosmic consciousness, right? So I think we're familiar with this. Each living entity participates in this one universal consciousness, whether it be plant, animal, etc., from the smallest living microbes and the individual cells in our body to the most complex organisms, including plants, animals, and humans. Rosicrucian teachings illustrate this through the analogy of an electrical circuit that has various lights of differing wattages and colors. Right? While their manifestations are different depending on their physical composition, whether it's a blue light, a green light, or a toaster, or whatever it might be, they are all energized by the same electric current. Excuse me. As humans, we can turn our consciousness inward to connect with deeper levels of this cosmic consciousness, which links us to all of the living things and other manifestations of this universal consciousness. So we can, by turning our consciousness inward, kind of connect with all of these other forms of life, which obviously with the shamans at the very beginning, we were talking about attest to when it comes to plants. And I'm sure many folks on this call are quite familiar with that through their personal experience. I wanted to close with this Monica Gagliano, and I think listen to her, been studying this field 25, 30 years at this point. And now let's just listen to her, and I think you'll kind of see she's kind of back to where we began with this presentation.
I cannot be around plants without them bothering me. We're like, oh, can you do this? And what about this? And you know that experiment that you wanted to do? Well, and you shouldn't do it with sunflowers. I think peas are going to be better for you. And it gets to the extreme, and again, we discussed it a little bit today as well, to the point that in building and nurturing this relationship, as you do with any relationship, you know, when you meet someone new at the beginning, you don't know how they move, what they like, and then as you spend more time together, you start syncing together, and you start moving and dancing together. And I think that applies to anyone, so plants as well. And in my experience, especially over the last few years, because of this interest of allowing for this relationship to be nurtured from both sides, yeah, people cannot even get to my house. And once they enter, there is always a plan that's like, oh, they need this. And it's like, shh. No, seriously. And then we talked about it today. It's like, then I can feel my body being moved to wherever, you know, whatever the plant, the whatever is needed. And I have no idea why or what. But it's like I have learned to trust that this relationship, which of course also has a foundation in communicative exchange of some kind, which again doesn't have to be like, oh, they literally talk to you. I don't have a puppet plant talking to me. But they do, and the information is delivered. You know it's not you, but it's delivered in a very clear way that the body knows exactly what is needed. And all you're required is to listen, to be open, and to do what you're told.
So that kind of brings us in. I'm very sorry, by the way, of those, you know, we thought we had all the technical things covered. And one important one was, gee, my laptop didn't have much power on it, and I didn't have it externally connected. So we lost power very locally in the laptop. But I'm glad we were able to rejoin. And so I want to thank you all. Hope there's a wonderful book, by the way, and she's actually quoted many times in this book. And it's like the best summation of the status of plant research in this area. It's recently published, called The Light Eaters. The Light Eaters. And it's by a journalist, not by Monica Gagliano, the scientist, but by a journalist. So it's called The Light Eaters. It's a great read. You can get an audiobook version of it. And it really will give you some insights on the current awareness in the scientific community on this kind of journey. So anyway, thank you again, and peace profound.